Welcome to the MarTech.org podcast.
My name is Lee Moroney. I'm the CEO of Storybook Marketing. I will let my co-host introduce himself.
Hey, y'all. I'm Eric Dates, leading the marketing and sales teams over at a software company called VComply.
I'd love your thoughts because intent is, sometimes it can feel like a buzzword. Sometimes it can feel like a requirement. If you don't have intent in your program, you're now flying blind and irresponsibly just throwing money away. But intent is everywhere and it seems to mean everything, and there's every different version of it. Why don't we start there? Let's set the stage for what is and is not intent, what kind of intent exists. What are your thoughts?
Oh, sure. I appreciate that start because I think it's so important to, like most things in marketing, to define what it is you're talking about. Make sure you're on the same page, right? When you use a word like intent. I feel like on the grand stage, the word intent, everyone associates it with purchase intent. Like, I'm here to buy something, right? I think, you'd probably agree with this, is that there's several forms of intent. It doesn't have to be in buy. I'm here to learn. I'm here to explore. I'm here to discover, right? There's all sorts of different levels of intent. So I think that's kind of how I look at it, right? It's just understanding, one, is this going to be a conversation around who wants to buy something, or is this going to be a deeper conversation around how many layers of intent are we trying to look at? So, love your thoughts on it too.
I totally agree. And I think that there's like two different versions of it, in the form of, there's intent that your audience is expressly giving you, where they're filling out a demo request. They're saying, yes, I'd like to talk to your sales team. That's express intent from them. I think what's become most of the intent conversation is us trying to infer that. And that, I think, is where most of the intent world seems to live right now.
Totally agree. I think, it's funny. I think, 5-6 years ago, maybe a little bit more, intent was synonymous with the brands out there. And again, I'll probably forget some of these brands, but the Sixth Senses, the Zoom Infos, all the things out there that are tracking that information. And it seems like it's grown into be such a common word across the board, to where, you're hearing CEOs talk about, intent lists and things like that. So it's funny to see how it started with a synonym for software functionality, and now it's at least becoming a little more broad, I guess, which is a positive move.
Yeah. And we hear first party, second party, third party. Like, what are your interpretations of different groupings of intent?
Sure. I mean, for me, third party goes straight to the, what can you buy, right? I think for me, I think that's where my brain goes in that world. Just to keep it short and sweet, I'm a huge fan of the first party, right? We all spend a lot of money on CRMs, HubSpot, Salesforce, all the things to track, capture, build demand. And I think the more you can build that data yourself, the more you actually at least can infer on, okay, well, I can see the journey here a little bit deeper than I can if I just put an intent keyword into a piece of software with a look back window of 60 days and say, yep, this person's in market. That's the one for us. So I think, to me, the first and third are probably have the biggest delta between them, just because with first party, it's a clearer story and it's easier to make hypothesis, versus the third party. To me, it's a bigger risk of looking into that third party space. But again, I know you have some thoughts on that as well, and I'd love to hear where your brain goes.
I'm a little bit of a contrarian on this one, and I will admit, and I've written an article for MarTech where I talked about the over-promisement of intent data. So I fall slightly on that side of the conversation. I'll put my hands up fully and say it. I think something you said was really interesting, which is like, what's the story that it's telling? And I think that's a really important one, because there's so many ways you can interpret it. And I think the problem is that we're often being told and being sold by a lot of intent vendors that this is going to, like you said, find your in-market buyers. And I think we should approach this with a lot of skepticism, because things that feel like they're obviously high intent don't necessarily mean the same thing that we think, like visiting the pricing page. We react to that like, this person is ready, they've got a credit card in hand. that's part of the evaluation process. I regularly look at the pricing pages of things I have absolutely no interest in buying, including competitors, including just looking at the layout of a pricing page to see how they're doing it versus how I want to do it. There's a million reasons to be on a pricing page. And I think there's this assumption that the journey is very logical and very linear. I have done all my research. I'm on your website. I've seen your pricing. I like what I see. I'm going to hit the demo request form. Let's have a conversation.
If only.
All of the data out there about how the buyer journey works says none of that is accurate.
Yep. You hit on a really interesting point too, to me, as you look at pricing pages, because that comes up a lot, right? Whether you're working with in-house, working with other businesses, they always love to retarget the pricing pages, invest a ton of money on the folks that are visiting there, like call these people 100,000 times a day until they answer so we can get in, talk pricing with them, because that's what they're curious about. And I know this is about intent, but is pricing pages, at least what I've studied and learned, is pricing pages are more of like, is the value I perceive the actual cost you're asking, right? That's really that's what that page is supposed to do. It's not a last step, to your point, before I get my card out and say, yep, here we go, that's what I want to do, in that linear fashion. It's more of to your point, it could happen at the beginning. It could be the first step. It's like, is this something I can afford? There's a question. Or is this worth what I think it is valued at to me? Should I pay this? Or there's a lot of questions out there. So to your point, I love the focus on the amount of variability just across the board. And that's just for one page.
Yeah.
Right. So as you look at the broader spectrum of, people who are maybe even visiting your website in those third-party intent queries where you're building a list, it's like, okay, back to the story. How can you know why you should reach out to this person?
And I think that's a really important piece about intent that I think is worth chatting through is, what is it? Not only what story does it tell? Because let's say, for argument's sake, that the intent data you've got tells exactly an accurate story. The people that are showing those intent signals are in market. They are genuinely looking to purchase it. What do you do from that point? How do you action on that information? And I think the thing
that's the question.
So you mentioned Sixth Sense. Sixth Sense brought out a really interesting buyer experience report recently. It was like a few weeks ago, and everything that's in there is very much in line with what Gartner says, with what all the other surveys say, which is that the buyer journey is largely 70% complete by the time they engage with anybody on the sales team. 84% of the time, they're going to go with the brand that was top of their list before they ever even came in market. And a lot of the data is saying that before they even start showing what we would consider intent signals, being on the website, multiple people from the organization starting to research it, a lot of the data says that by that point, they've already narrowed it down to a few people. And if you weren't in that list, it's almost impossible to get in. I think the number from the report was that if you weren't in the original consideration set, you have a 14% chance of actually getting in a later stage. So there's sort of a kind of this catch-22 where if you see intent data, that's great, but it doesn't mean go after them now and start marketing to them. It means that they're already mostly through their journey. So if you haven't gotten them with the marketing, it's not really the point at this stage.
You hit on that, right? And I know we've chatted about this in the past a little bit. It's when does the marketing start? To your point right here, it's like a lot of the marketing tends to happen, especially these days with high pressure on, marketing, building revenue, marketing, building close-won business, is a lot of the marketing starts with the intent data and then they start doing things versus I think what you and I believe, and feel free to totally correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the marketing occurs before the intent, right? We're the big story of a series of massive events, whether how they entered the business or how they found us, et cetera, that happens before the want to purchase begins, or at least the want to look at software begins. So I think that in itself is probably a rabbit hole we could dive into a little bit.
And I think, I think it's where it starts to feel like the selling of intent data often sounds like they're telling you that they're going to help you find those bullseye people. And I think that's the thing that I've always found that sets it up for failure, because it's not to say intent data has no value. That is definitely not the argument. It's that if you're promising that it's helping you skip the hard work of actually winning brand consideration, then yeah, you're probably going to be let down by it. And I made a mistake on this actually, even in the past. When I was one job where I was the head of marketing in a tech company. They were in the mobile space. We brought on, I believe it was demand based at the time, and this was sort of early. Intent was now like the hyper promise thing, and I bought fully into it. I thought, like, this is great. I believe this, and we spent a lot of time building out these signals, and we said, like, okay, we want to know if they're searching for this and that. And we loaded in all the target accounts. I sold this hard to the sales team. Like, that was my problem. I promised the world. This was a crystal ball. And I will say the data was actually quite accurate. It genuinely was. So we had an account at the time. It was McDonald's. It was the key account. I had a couple of the AEs that were on top of this. And I said, hey, McDonald's is expressing all this intent signals. They're on our website. They're searching for this topic. Like, there were enough clusters of data where I was like, this feels real. Like, let's jump on this. And we jumped on it. Like, we put together this highly polished video where the AE was like expressing, like, here's what we know about your account. Here's where we were going to be the perfect client. And we found the right contacts. We sent it through. We sent gifts. Like, we threw everything at this. And we got the meeting, which was great. And the AE got on the meeting and the person said, like, I loved everything you sent. Everything you said is great. I wish you talked to me 4 months ago, because that's when we had picked a vendor. And I was like, oh, so you were rounding out the RFP. And that's exactly what they were doing.
Wow. But I think that it shines a light on the positives of the intent data, right? Because to your point, it's not like we're over here cynical is all hell, and it's like nothing works. It definitely works, and the data there definitely is real. The timeliness is a variability, of course. To your point, it's like, what can you extrapolate from that data? That's always the big question. But I think that back to the double-edged sword of this intent data, and the reason why it continues to be a topic at sales teams, marketing teams, C-level conversations, is because it does work, right? Every so often, you just nail it. You get a meeting. It's like you build the right targets. Your accounts are showing some signals. You get in touch with the sales team. They jump on it. Becomes opportunity. Close one business. Done. Great. Awesome. This stuff is magic sauce. Let's continue to lean into this. And I think those wins that happen, whether it's a story that you hear or it's something you experienced yourself, that's what keeps that conversation of intent going. And again, I think that's why it's shortened or narrowed itself into just a buying intent conversation.
So I like that. And I know, the point of this talk is about having success, and we could talk about all the reasons that you can't have success with it and you'll overestimate. Where have you seen it work? Like, let's talk about where it changes what you would have done from a marketing point of view.
Sure. So I'll start with a third party, because I think that's probably what a lot of folks, are tasked with, right? Diving into their Zoom info accounts or 6 Sense accounts, et cetera, all the other providers out there. So you're building lists based on keywords, probably product related, or at least people looking for software in some capacity or whatever your product or service may be. I think where I've seen a lot of success is niching down to the micro groups as much as you can. I think it's pretty common for a lot of folks to build a massive list of intent and say, okay, here's my big intent, keep it dynamic. I want to continue updating as people all hit this specific keyword. And that could work, but I think where I see it really flourish is when you break it down, and no different to any other marketing list that we're going to build. It's the more granular you can get, the more, to me, that's personalization, right? That the more relevant you can make it specifically to that individual, the better it's going to be. So in the past, as we looked at building lists for, product focused campaigns, we we filter those lists down to the smallest groups, and we figure out, should this be sales reaching out? Should this be the marketing team putting them into some sort of campaign? Should we advertise to them? And it kind of gives you an opportunity to do a couple things, which I would classify as wins. So as you're looking at building lists that you may want to retarget or build some ads targeted toward, you can use that to learn about your messaging at a product level with people that are actually interested in the realm of your product. So I think there's a good success that you can do there. It's worth the investment. Regardless if you close business or not, you can gauge some ideas around what ads are working well. Is my message resonating with this, this group enough to get them to click on my ad, right? Which is a rarity these days. But I see success there. And then on the flip side, it's like, diving into with the sales team, going after it, giving them those accounts where they might be more specialized in the conversation, having them reach out directly versus this marketing team reach out. I think figuring out that give and take between the two teams, I've seen a lot of success there when I just take it and pass it over directly to the sales team. Say, here's the folks we need to go after. Here's your landing page for them. Go get it done.
I love that you mentioned the sales aspect, and we're gonna come back to that about where does this live and who uses it. We have a question that I want to talk through from Quincy. It's a great question, which is,
Sure.
How can we differentiate between high intent signals that indicate genuine buying interest versus those that reflect early stage research or casual browsing, and what actions should we take at each stage to nurture those leads?
It's a great question.
Do you want to start on this one? You want to take it?
Sure. I'll jump in on the high intent aspect. I think, and again, it sounds to me like this is more of a question on the third party side. Again, when we talk about this, my first reaction would be, let's dive into the clearest picture we have, right? To me, I use HubSpot a lot. I'm not saying if you don't have it, you should get it, but I use it a lot. So to me, it's jumping into that CRM and seeing what's their journey been. Do we have their information already? Is it something that we can dive into the story and see what pages have they viewed? What actions have they taken? So I think a lot of marketing data, as we look at signals, it is behavior. And if you can track the behavior, you can make a theory or a hypothesis that, okay, if they visit this page, they visit a product page 2 or 3 times, maybe looked at the pricing page, to your point, came back to the product pages again, explored a little bit more. Maybe you're running some heat maps or recording sessions where you can start to see the date, right? Look at the date of that person's session in HubSpot, try to find the recording. I know I do that quite a bit, and see what they did, as creepy as that is. But I like to look into that because I think that's your clearest picture into saying, oh, wow, look at them. They clicked on that video. They stayed on that frame to watch that video. They continued to scroll downward and kind of do that ideal journey. I think that's how you can start to build those lists. And again, it takes time. I think that's where a lot of marketing teams kind of get over ambitious, is they think they can just build a very quick list and say, yep, here we go. Let's just start firing away and spending money. Versus if we spend a few more hours of time and just really dive into these individual, behaviors, you can start to truly delineate which ones have actual intent versus which ones just jumped on a product page for 4 or 5 seconds and hopped off. So I'll pass it over to you because I don't want to vomit all over this thing.
No, I totally agree with you. And I think that the high intent piece is worth talking about, because I think this has always been the sort of problem that we found ourselves in, because there's never enough inbounds. You always need more hand raisers. And before intent became the thing, it was lead scoring, and we were, again, inferring high intent. And I think that's the danger, that like the clearest version of high intent is when someone expressly raises their hand to say, I would like to talk to someone. And everything below that is generally a form of it's inferred intent, or it's predicted intent, or it's something to that level. So I think there's a slight danger, and I've seen this, and this is kind of where we veer into where I think there's the controversial uses of things. Like a big thing that's a topic right now, and it's a very hot button thing on LinkedIn, and I have feelings about this, is this de-anonymization tools where someone lands on your site and then you pounce on them. That to me is not all that different from, like throwing the sales team at someone who downloaded an ebook. It's, again, we're saying you're on our site, therefore we're going to jump on you. And I think there's a big risk in thinking that's high intent and treating it like it's someone who is like, if we don't get them now, we'll lose the window. Because I think, generally speaking, all the data would say in B2B sales, certainly higher ticket, long sales cycle, big ACV, multi-party type deals, it doesn't really work like that, where you have a tiny window where if the competitor gets to them, like, you've lost them. It's just not an impulse buy. So I think if they're at that level of intent, your job is more about making it easy for them to find their way into a conversation, not pouncing on them for fear of losing that window of time. I've just never seen data that supports that that's the thing. And there's more risk in doing that than there is benefit, because you can end up pushing them and getting them to feel like, oh, that's not really how I wanted to engage with you. So I think that's the big fear I have with the high intent that is not expressly a hand raiser type intent.
Completely agree. I think, to hit on the latter half of this question is what action should we take? at each stage to nurture these leads, right? That first notification, usually the answer is not send the army to go bombard their inbox and phone and everything. That whole concept of speed to lead, while there is some, some good philosophy there, to your point, Liam, it's delicate, right? Because it's kind of like fishing, right? If the second you get a little nibble, you're not just going to rip the thing out like, oh, I got a fish, dang. Of course it's not going to bite. You got to wait, you got to sit there, keep that lure in the water, because there's going to be a few more nibbles before it actually takes the full bite, because it's got to pass the sniff test. So to get into, thank you. I love fishing too, so it's easy. But the point being, it's easier than ever these days as we look at a cynical market across the board. It's almost like people are looking for reasons not to purchase as much as they are to purchase, and sometimes how you treat them inbound can lead to that decision at that first touch point. So I see we've got a question.
Yeah, I just want to pitch something in. One of the co-founders of HubSpot made a really good point. He said, give value before you ask for something. And a lot of problems with intent is we see a little bit of intent and we want to blizzard them with messages. But the bottom line is what we need to do is blizzard them with value. We need to give them value. So in other words, you're interested in this. Let's give you more information on what you're interested in. And when we give you more information that you're interested in, we're starting to build a relationship, showing you that we don't want to just take from you, but we want to give to you. We want to give you value. And if we give you value, then we're going to build a level of trust between us.
I think that's a terrific point. And actually, there's a really good data point with this. I was lucky enough, I had a great conversation with Kerry Cunningham. If anyone doesn't know him, he's one of the I think he's the thought leader at 6 Sense. He was one of the principal analysts at, I believe it was Forrester and I think it was Serious Decisions, a bunch of those anyway. Super smart guy. He's very knowledgeable on intent data, worth a follow on LinkedIn at a minimum. But I had a great conversation with him where I was asking him about exactly this question, but like, what do you do when they're in these stages? Like, what are you giving them? What are you putting in front of them? And he made a point that I had never really thought of, which was that even if the data is accurate, and for example, like to Quincy's question, that someone is looking like that they're casually starting to do research, whether you've got 6 Sense, Demandbase, any of these tools, and your data saying, oh, they're in a consideration phase. What all of the data has found is that people can be in that phase for an indefinite amount of time. They can jump into it, they can jump out of it, and then they can come back. It's not a linear thing where, hey, you're in an awareness stage, I need to move you to a consideration stage. It's what do I think is interesting to you at this time? To your point, Jim, let me give you something that's of use at that moment. Hopefully it informs what you need to move yourself to the next stage. It's not my job to move you there. And
I think to jump on that as well, it starts with a mentality shift to me as we look at team culture across the marketing, sales, executive teams. It's so easy to look at these behaviors and just see dollar signs, right? Instead of seeing an actual human being out there, you can put yourself in that seat. So I think that shift alone, right, as we look at marketing and sales leaders, it's so important to get that into your team and ingrained into their brains that if you approach them as dollar signs, you're going to treat them like money, which that's a short-term relationship, right, for all of us. And if we're in the business of building long-term relationships, if that actually is true, which I think it should be, obviously, it's hard to get to that level, especially if you're getting a lot of pressure to go push sales. But if you want to build an authentic relationship with an individual, with a prospect, to actually be there to help them, I think it goes back to Jim's point. Make some theories, deliver some value with them, over-deliver something to them before you ask for something. I think that can be a challenge to get that, to give the thumbs up from your boss sometimes. So again, not discounting that hurdle. But to me, it goes back to that broader company culture of like, are you actually, and I say this often, you'll see on as I banter on my LinkedIn, are you here to be customer first, or do you have that mentality of we need customers first? I think those two are very polarizing, but it's super important. And folks on the call, people who listen, is you can champion that culture, you can champion that mentality shift, and it takes time. You're not going to discount that.
And Quincy, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that you're touching on an important shift in marketing philosophy. It's like the traditional view of marketing, as a one-way push to move customers through the sales funnel. It's becoming outdated, in today's customer-centric landscape. So marketers must evolve and kind of like, think of things more in terms of long-term relationships over short-term gains. I mean, we have to shift from transactional to relational now, and prioritize customer experience as the priority. So thank you for answering the question. And I do also want to chime in and say that to Eric, nothing that we do as marketers is actually creepy.
You're so right about the transactional thing. And I think the thing we don't often talk about is, like to your point about like, do we need customers first? We don't, when you get aggressive about it, when you use things like intent data as a, like, this is the pool from which I will hit my target, what you don't count is who did you lose by trying to go down that path. Like that's that short-term, long-term mindset. Bingo. And oftentimes that's the stuff you can't track, right? As we look at marketing, often it's the silent poison in the well is the negative effects of a very aggressive push, right? I hear these numbers happen from marketing teams and sales teams. Often it's, well, if you make 100 touch points, 2 of them will convert. And my first question always is, what happens to the other 98? Like, did you make them mad enough to never come back? So it's a big risk. So I think finding that fine dance between number of touch points, delivering value, figuring out who makes the touch points when, that's the chessboard we're all on right now. Yeah. The other thing, you mentioned customer centricity, and I think that's a really important thing. What I found to be very helpful is instead of looking at intent signals as an opportunity for us, it's trying to understand what is happening with them. What does that represent in their terms? And so I've gone down these rabbit holes of reading research reports about what is happening during the buyer set, what is happening during all of that buyer journey. And there's a lot of really interesting things. And Kerry Cunningham actually is another example. He said this to me on that same call that I had with him recently, where when they develop those consideration sets early on, once you get into this awareness stage, once the intent signal starts showing up and people are in this stage, a lot of what they're actually doing is they're trying to validate what they believe to be true. If they've already picked 2 or 3 companies that they think these are the ones that I think are the right fit for us, there's an amount of confirmation bias where they want that to be true because there's a lot of time goes into it. He gave me this stat that if you add 1 extra person into the buying committee, it ends up 1 extra vendor. If you add that to your list of potential vendors, it on average extends the buying journey by about 3 months and adds 2 more people into the buying group. So there's an incentive on the buyers to keep this small. They want a small list. So they're not looking at everyone for exactly that reason. They'll never end up buying anything. Designed by committee, it all goes, we know exactly how it goes. The status quo wins. So once they're at that phase, once those intent signals are showing up, they're trying to prove to the other people in the group that this is what they said it is, because they're putting their personal and professional reputations at stake for these vendors. And they're just making sure that they've just checked their boxes, they've crossed their T's, they've dotted their I's. So a lot of it, to Jim's point, it's about giving them the things that goes, yeah, you were right about this. Like, we're going to prove to you that you were not betting wrong, because everything comes back to risk in B2B buying. There's enormous risk in getting it wrong. That's why the vendors like, the nobody got fired for buying IBM is true, because it's easier to buy a vendor that's not that great, but nobody would fire you for choosing, than to go for the one that's a better vendor but has higher risk. I love that. I completely agree. And it's, I think we had a question pop in. I want to pull that up and check that out from Don, talking a little bit about what we consider intent signals. And we fit on this a little bit, Don, but just to kind of get into that a little bit more, right? As we look at intent signals, we talked about third party versus first party, trying to see where is that data coming from. First of all, where is the signal and what can you extrapolate from that story? So looking at, maybe to bring in something that, that's awesome. Bringing in something from what Quincy said, which is more like the philosophy. When I hear what Quincy was saying around shifting that outdated mentality of marketing into the modern state,
building those relationships with customers, I think when we look at intent, we should put the product intent aside, because I think that's something we all want to do. But when we see behavior, because that's all replace intent with behavior, when we see behavior that justifies a touch point, justifies us reaching out, I think that's where, going back to Quincy's point, the relationship opportunity begins. So as people show intent to learn, to discover, to potentially purchase, that shift in mentality from our side becomes, back to Jim's point, how can we deliver value? How can we start that conversation authentically in a way that's not going to scare them away? And I think as we look at the whole spectrum, whether that is at the first, free top of funnel, I'm just here to learn who the heck you guys are because I saw an ad, or I heard about you from a friend, all the way down to, oh yeah, I've visited 17 of your competitors and I really like this, I keep coming back to it. I think we need to step back and look at that whole picture and use the arrows in our quiver, for communication very wisely.
You said something really interesting. You use the term behaviors as opposed to intent. I think that's actually a really important distinction, because I'm a stickler for language, and intent can give you the impression that it means it's what they are going to do or what they're planning to do. And I think it's not really what it is, because I think there's high intent to talk to a salesperson, and that is someone expressly asking to talk to a salesperson. Everything else is behavior, where you're trying to approximate where they are in a particular stage, more so than it is what they want. Because I think it's not high intent to buy or plans to buy. It might be they're narrowing down their list and they're just trying to make sure that they have all of the technical things that are part of the requirements. They might be filling out an RFP and they might be gathering information for that. They might be just curiously looking around, knowing that they have a problem, but it could be 6 months before they actually have the ability to solve that problem. So all of it is just about where are they in their phase. And I think the thing to consider is that first party intent I want to say it's the most reliable form that you have, because you know that they're on your properties. And at least that means whether they're about to enter a sales process is outside of our control, and in often cases outside of our ability to even accurately predict. But at least it means you're being considered, you're being researched, there's something reliable there. All of the other data is speculation. It depends on what you're trying to answer with that speculation. Like, oh, they're reading this topic. We're in the FinServe category and they're researching topics about mergers and acquisitions. When you get into a danger zone with the third-party data, where if you don't, it's been sold as a tell us what you want to know and we'll give you the answers. I want to know who's searching for this topic. I want to know who's doing this thing. You have to be very careful to not sort of look for keywords you wish they were searching versus understanding what they would be searching if they were actually trying to buy something, because they're very, very different.
Yeah, I've been behind my question, which I'm going to echo here. Sorry. Can we meet that? All right. From intent data, and it's kind of, you guys are going through it, to me, where are they going to research our product before they come to our site? But you mentioned the danger in that is how valid is that intent data? And then it goes to influencers. I think when we think about people who influence to others to buy our product, who are they going to first before us? All those seem to be intent data is before they get to our property. How do we get this knowledge of where before they enter a late stage funnel to learn about our product, and that that could be Zoom info, you're right, that could be search data, that could be what is the guides that they're going to learn about our competitors compared to us before they come to our property, and I think that's up to a lot of us to try to make sure we're understanding those sources of data and can reach out.
I think it's a great point. And I'm a big advocate for the audience research piece of it. There are great tools out there that are extremely low cost. SparkToro is one example that's well worth checking out, because to your point, the question that we should be asking is exactly what you asked. Where are they getting the information? Who do they trust? Where do they do their research? Because I think we look at it from the data point of view and we say, who's researching this topic? Let's get in front of them. if they're researching the topic, there's a good chance they've already started to develop a consideration set in their mind. So it's much more effective to be where they are than to try and get to where they're going.
And I think to jump into this a little bit, to give some ideas out there for folks that are using third-party intent data. And we've talked about this a little bit, is intent is the result of good marketing in a perfect world, right? Like your marketing, you've got great programs happening, building demand. In theory, your intent should be growing, or at least reaching a plateau and staying there, not going downward. So some things that you can do to kind of put some useful ideas out there for folks from stuff I've been doing in the past. It's for third parties, put your own branded terms in there and see, are people searching this? Are people actually looking for us, right? You can look at that in Google. You can look at that in the paid platforms. You can look at that in a bunch of different ways. But similar to this theory that a friend of mine came up with, and I'll mention his name in a minute, but it's look at your retargeting audiences. Are they growing? Or are they shrinking? Right? There's some good KPIs you can do there to kind of see, are we building enough demand? Because demand leads to intent, right? Unless I'm seeing that wrong. Good demand generation does lead to more people wanting what you have to offer. But I think looking at those two indicators, right, are more people searching for us brand-wise versus searching for us categorically. I think those are some good things to look at too, as you look at figuring out, again, why should you reach out to people and prioritizing those intent lists. People who already know you versus people that are just looking at the broad spectrum. That's a simple one, right? Okay, people who are at least looking for us versus looking for people like us or businesses that offer what we offer. I think those two little tidbits are helpful as you look at prioritizing who to reach out to and when, or how to build that next drip campaign, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And especially on the third-party stuff, it's important to know how people find vendors in your category, because there is a valid case where you might be something that they don't know how to buy. They don't know any of the vendors in the category, and they begin their search with a Google search. That does happen. It happens much less as you get into more expensive technology and the higher ACV ones. So it's important to know, like, how do we find people who are looking for things like us? Is how do they find things like us in the first place? Is this done in peer groups? Is this done through experts? Are influencers a very valid part of this? I think a lot of that comes back to just understanding how they even develop a consideration set.
I love that. Yep. Just the more you can know your customer or potential customers, right? I think it all boils down to that, understanding their behaviors, not just the things they're doing at their job, their jobs to be done, but understanding, to your point, like, how do they buying stuff? Have they bought something before? Is this their first time buying something? Because that could be totally different than someone who's purchasing this for the fifth time, sixth time. Seniority, time into job. There's all sorts of variables, right? Liam, we hit on that at the beginning. As you look at intent, the variability there of how you treat someone who's searching for your software compared to another person who's searching for your software, lumping them into the same bucket, sending them the same communication, can also come with its own risk, right? Because maybe it's my first time. Hey, I'm searching this. I visited your product page 500 times in the past 90 days because I'm horrified that I got to pitch this to my boss, and I want to make sure I nail exactly why we have to buy this. Versus the other folks that, I visited your product page twice just to make sure nothing's changed because I purchased this in the past, or my friend said this to me, right? So the more you can dive into the niche, and I'll continue to hound this till the cows come home, is the more you can dive into those micro segments and understand, see that data. If you have the first party, dive into that story. You have the third party, drill down into it, right? Stress test the heck out of it. Don't just take it at face value, because that can help justify why you're sending those touch points to those folks, and they can help you be more successful when you do actually end up pressing send or firing that ad or whatever it may be.
And I think the stress testing thing is actually a really interesting thing. You ask any data scientist and they'll tell you, like, watch for outliers in data. Intent is a big piece of this, especially as you get even first party, but definitely third party, where it's not one data point tells you everything. One data point can be completely wrong. It could be a false positive. It's about trying to get more and more, because once it starts to build and you've got multiple different types of things pointing you in a direction, then it becomes a lot more likely. Like, they're searching on a topic. There's at least 2 people from the company on your website. They've been there twice over the last week. Then it starts to shape a story. You're like, okay, something's clearly happening, but one of those alone could be just a false positive.
Love it. Jim.
Yeah. This is why it's important to consider statistical significance. If we're doing research and we make decisions based on really small data sets, we can sometimes get into trouble on that. So it's really important to make sure that the data we're collecting, we have enough data that we can really say, yeah, this is significant as opposed to, oh, this is just a random thing and we just made an assumption.
Oh, and we made this mistake with lead scoring already, where we thought we could get like a score of 50 from 2 email opens, 1 download, and suddenly we've predicted human behavior. Like, it just doesn't work that way.
I completely agree.
One thing I want to leave a little bit of time for, because you brought it up earlier, was sales and intent. I think we've talked a lot about marketing using intent. How can and should sales be involved in this process?
I think that is a fantastic question, because again, how you're using this intent is kind of probably why we're all here. And to me, and Liam, I think we've talked about this in the past, is this is a sales conversation in theory, right? A lot of people want this. So you look at CEOs, C-suite, trying to see, why are we spending X amount on this intent data? How are we using it? What's our ROI, right? That means, where's the revenue? In black and white. So to me, it becomes I think intent data should be a sales function. It should be owned by the sales team. Going back to what I said previously, good marketing is what happens before the intent occurs, right? Whether it's you're hearing it through an influencer, Jim, to your point, or if you're seeing it on SEO, paid search, whatever it may be, however they discovered it, that's the marketing aspect. That's what we can control, right? We can influence them enough and encourage that behavior enough to where they start to show intent. When it becomes time to buy, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see a lot of marketing teams hopping on sales calls to close business. So that's where I kind of stand up. I'm curious to see what your thoughts are.
I agree. I will let Tim. I want to make sure we leave room. You want to jump in?
Yeah. So I understand the focus on intent, but one thing I think that's well worth considering is what the awareness triggers are. In other words, what was it that actually moved them down? Because if you think of Google's messy middle study, it really starts from the awareness trigger. The rest is in the messy middle, from category heuristics, the social proofing, the scarcity bias, authority bias, power free, etc. So I think a big part of that is really think about, what was the awareness trigger that started the journey down?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic point. Yeah, I think it goes back to what Eric said, that all of that is what happens before the triggers start showing up in the forms of intent data. Like, it's all of that. It's the psychology aspect of it. How do you get into their mind? How do you connect yourself to the problem? How do you stay top of mind for the time that they are? How do you make sure you're near to mind when they have those problems? All of that is those heuristics. It is all those things like the category entry point conversations, jobs to be done. Like, it's a lot of understanding just how do you emotionally connect yourself to people.
Yep. Totally. And going back to the value conversation of increasing that value perceived into the value believed, to kind of quote Flint McLaughlin, one of my favorites, Liam, I know you know who he kind of following his stuff. He's a big believer in those heuristics. And I think the more you can tilt that fulcrum in favor of building that value at the beginning, it's going to encourage that intent, right? And you make that conversation easier. Going back to what Quincy was saying, in Quincy, what I heard when you say, to me, Peter Drucker came first to mind, was that concept of marketing being, the whole purpose of marketing is to eliminate the process of selling, making selling irrelevant, which in theory is great, but I'm sure he didn't anticipate where we'd be at, in 2024 moving forward. So totally agree on uncovering those triggers and the awareness at the beginning. If you can get that data, I think would be my only challenge, because that's the tough part, right? To kind of go into that dark purgatory realm with the messy middle, whatever you want to call it. Trying to see that is also tough. And I'll speak for the folks in the startup side for a little bit, just because, Jim, you mentioned something around data, making sure you have enough data to make that decision. I work predominantly in companies that are less than 2 million a year in revenue, because I have a problem with my brain, but that's for a separate conversation. But sometimes you don't have all the data and you have to make that assumption, or you have to make that strong theory and not necessarily bet your career on it, but you have to make some aggressive moves, because that's just the nature of the game. So I think getting to enough data to where you feel comfortable making a decision is probably what I would recommend for folks on the call, is because we'd all love to have that perfect story to where we have a perfect picture and say, yep, here's exactly who we should go doing Y. I've got strong theory. Here's my method. Here's my equation. We don't all have that luxury. So I think a recommendation from my side is just wait till you feel confident enough conviction to where if you were questioned, could you justify why? I think that's where I would go.
And I want to double down on something you said about the control aspect, because I think it is really important that when you have intent signals, especially ones that are seemingly later stage, first party type things, it's not about what can I do to try and move that thing faster. It's how can I make sure that I'm supporting the sales effort to essentially land that plane successfully. And I think that's a lot of where I think there's a lot of power, especially if you've got ABM programs where marketing can come to the table and go, here's what we know. Here's what we think we should be doing. When's the last time we've reached out to this? For sales, a lot of this is forecasting. It's for them making sure they're knowing where they're placing their time, because if some of their target accounts are in market, they need to be making sure they're keeping that relationship healthy, and marketing can support by going, here's what else we can do to bring value to that conversation. It's not about controlling. It's not about changing outcomes. It's about successfully landing that plane.
And back to your point, the initial question of where should it live, and the sales side, I mean, yes, the answer is both. I preach this from the mountaintops that marketing and sales should be the same team. I think they're the same function. They both want to achieve the same end behavior. It's just one tends to happen before the other. But going back to that conversation, I think opening up to where it's not just, I show the sales team when it's time, like, we're the gatekeepers of all this data, right? You don't want to do that. Trust me, been there. It's a bad decision. You want to loop them into this conversation earlier so that they know that data is there as well. So you can explore those conversations together, because as much as it may pain some folks, it's a fantastic opportunity to welcome your sales team into this data pool so they can throw their ideas at you as well. Not saying you have to take all of them, because they're going to be focused on give me those accounts so I can call them today. But I think it's a healthy debate, and it opens up more room for good collaboration to get to, that discussion, that dance between sales and marketing touch points to make that close one business.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And much as I could talk about this for a lot more, I want to be aware of where we are from time. We are just about out of time. It's been a fantastic conversation. Eric, I think you and I could talk forever, but this was such a fantastic conversation. Thank you everyone for joining. Eric, thank you so much for a good conversation.
Thanks, Liam. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the MarTech.org podcast. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at martech.org/newsletters.